Welcome back to the second hour of LoveBabz, Love Talk. When the music goes longer, that means Harry's still fiddling with gadgets and stuff. Welcome back to LoveBabz, Love Talk on Babz Rawls-Ivy. I'm delighted to have my good friend Nicholas Dawidoff back in conversation because I read this book. And today is paperback day, right? It comes out in paperback today.
I think that's true. That's the rumor on the boulevard.
Is that the rumor on the streets, the publishing streets?
Yeah, that's what they tell me.
Nicholas, can I
If
tell you?
ever they talk to me.
I talked about this book so much. I had people on Martha's Vineyard going and buying it, like a bunch of people, because I would sit on the porch and read this book every day, and then I don't know what kept me from not flinging it across the street at people, but people were like, "Oh, what are you reading?" And then they would come on the porch, and I was like, "Oh, this damn book right here!" So people sent me pictures of them buying this book on Martha's Vineyard. Just want you to know. And my
Now
friend
we have to
Jack.
hope. Now we got to hope that they'll just send you, porches across America, people sitting and reading.
This book was tough. This was tough, Nicholas. I didn't read it the last two times we talked. I hadn't read it yet, so I just finished it on Martha's Vineyard last month, and there was so much I didn't know. I just didn't know so much.
Well, that's kind of my job.
It's a
Things,
good job, and I wrote you a long email about it.
I did, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
I wrote Nicholas this long email because I think people were like, I had this conversation with Paul Bass about it too. I think people were like, Bass, if you don't shut up about this book, we're gonna push you down a flight of stairs. Because everywhere I went, I talked about it. And then I slowed myself down because I had to think, you had to write this. Like as you were writing this, Nicholas, and because you didn't really know this story until you got into this story.
Well, I think when you're writing a book like this, you are trying to find a way to tell a specific and particular story that reflects the broader thematic story that you're trying to tell. And I knew the broader thematic story from the time I was a child in New Haven. And New Haven, right, is a representative city. It has it's just a smaller version of so many American cities. And it has so many of the virtues and wonderful qualities and also challenges of many American cities. So if you go to Baltimore, it's just kind of in some ways New Haven 4 times bigger, right? And you could say the same thing about parts of Philadelphia and on across, the heartland. And if you go through life and you see what you knew as a child replicated across time, and some of the problems that you saw, and just as a child, you saw them and you notice them, but you're a kid, and so you don't really know what to do with that other than to say, why should that be? At a certain point, I felt as though I want to leave New York where I lived and come back to where I grew up and really grapple with those problems. And what I'm mainly talking about is, post-industrial communities across the country.
Mm-hmm. I think you did a great job of teaching us about what that migration story looked like very personally, not because of you, but because of what it means to New Haven to have people come up from the South and to commit and create community here. Like you really laid that out for people. And even though we all know it, we didn't know it. I was struck by how personal that felt to me, knowing that part, because my people are from the South too, and they came up under the same sort of circumstances. It's just not anything that we ever really talk about. It's just a given, right? Like because a whole bunch of people did it, and my folks worked at Winchester, then Olin Brass, and then American Linen, which the Yale Police Department sits on. So that
Weren't those
part
the
is.
green? Those were the green and white vans, right?
Yes, the green. It was a commercial laundry, and they took care of all the linens for nightclubs, bars, restaurants, and some of the hospital because the hospital had an overflow of sheets and towels and stuff like that. And so my parents worked there after in the lean days when Winchester was thinning out, and they worked there. And so yeah, so it gave me a part of a story that I knew. I mean, because we know the story of migration where some people went to Chicago, the people who were in the Midwest, like in Arkansas and all those places, went to Chicago and California and those places, and people in South Carolina and Georgia and all those places came to Connecticut and New York. And so I was struck by the teachable moments of that. I also was struck by um you went in to tell the story of just about everybody. Like everybody had a backstory. Like you didn't leave any backstory out. Like everybody had some backs. Even the villains had backstories.
Well, I think everybody's complicated, and even for things that go wrong in life, there's always an explanation, even if it's the individual's own explanation. Most things in human life don't come from nowhere, and so I think you can't really understand a city or places unless you understand all the different motivations that lead individuals to make their decisions. And if you talk to enough, I mean, for this book, I think I talked to over 500 people. I know I did.
Yeah.
And I guess one of the reasons is that I was thinking I wanted to find a neighborhood which was a representative American neighborhood that could speak to many of the problems, not only, and again, the virtues and the triumphs, not only of that neighborhood itself, but it could speak to many other neighborhoods that had some larger qualities in common. And I think to do that, the only responsible way to do that is to do your best. I mean, I would have spoken to the whole city if I could have, and that's not possible, but I spoke to as many people as I could. And so, as you know, from the time when we met, the last question was always, who do you think I should talk with? And, you would say, because everybody remembers life differently, especially when they encounter somebody just in a moment. There are only a couple of specific things that'll come quickly to mind. And I remember for you, for example, it was telling about that truck that came up from the Carolinas, where a farmer had come up through the night to sell fresh greens all around the neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So how do you sort through? You talk to 500 people, Nicholas. How do you sort through? And how do you hold yourself through all these conversations? Because some of these conversations are not going to be joyous. Some of these conversations are not going to be easy, right? Like some of these conversations are going to be painful. I don't know if you could shield yourself. How do you hold yourself through all these conversations and not be like, whew?
Well, I'm not, that's a really good question. And, who Matthew Desmond is? The person who wrote about eviction, and he's written recently a book about poverty. And I remember one of the things that he was saying in his notes on the sources for his book about eviction was that in talking to people day after day whose lives are not going the way they hope they will go and who are really struggling with serious life issues, I don't think you could be a human being if you weren't on some level feeling down yourself about what other people are going through. And then you couldn't also be a halfway decent human being if you didn't immediately say to yourself, well, this isn't my life. This is this person's life. So who am I to feel so badly when I'm just the person who's trying to understand a series of lives of which this is one? But I think it is unmistakable that in writing about a group of people where there is a fair amount of struggle and pain, and not only that, but where that is a serious element of the story you're telling, if you're going to do it well, you have to remind yourself to find places of solace, because if you don't, it can get very upsetting.
Yeah.
Because I feel as though, one of the reasons that I did this is because when I was a child growing up in New Haven, some of the things that I was seeing and I didn't understand as a child, but just sensed, had a feeling for, were upsetting. And it's just, we're talking about structures of the country, nothing a kid could do anything about but notice. But you would notice how close some of your friends who were growing up who with a real serious lack of opportunity, real struggle. And we're talking about issues surrounding food and clothing and things. And then right over there, just a short walk away are children who are having a very different life experience. And to see that juxtaposition was for me always really confusing. And as a child, I always want to know what it meant. Like, why should this be? Why are there these great divisions and gulfs just in life experience at such proximity? And it just felt to me as a kid confusing. And I think that one of the things, photographers talk about is these great photographers are people who can see life with the clarity of a child, because children don't have many, many, many other experiences to confuse and to explain away and so forth. They just see things with a certain kind of almost poetic purity, right? Or that's how we imagine it. There's just not enough experience to confuse things. It's an immediate perception. And that immediate perception, I mean, it first really came to me when I was playing baseball at Bowen Field. And I just remember, sort of looking out through the backstop up at how close Yale University was from the baseball field we were playing on, which, had a lot of glass and it was dusty, and kids around me, some of them were struggling in certain ways, even though we didn't talk about it. And when you think about things like that, you think of, as a kid, again, as I said, you're just sort of saying, this seems weird to me that there should be this abrupt demarcation. And why would this be? But then, as you go through life, you hear many explanations and you hear lots of things. But if you go back to that pure initial feeling of surprise and confusion, that was really my guide for the entire story. I really, as kids, we didn't talk about these things, but I want to know what that felt like.
Now, you could have, and coming back to New Haven from being away, and this is your hometown, this is where you're from. You could have wrote a different story. Like you could have just written it. You're talented, you're award-winning, you're celebrated. You could have written a different story. But what was it about? I understand the piece about reckoning with your childhood and what you saw, but there's so many other stories you could have written about. What was it about? Because this is so layered, and I get this when I read this. When I read this book, I felt like you were telling and teaching at the same time. That's how I felt. I felt like you were teaching us something, and then you were telling us something, and then you were sharing something. That's my experience of the book. Like I felt like it was a master class in community. It was a master class in rethinking and reimagining policing. It was a master class in how certain communities are handled and other communities aren't handled in terms of law enforcement. I felt that very acutely,
Well, I think one of the things that was challenging, and maybe I waited as long as I did in life to do this, even though I'd been thinking about it for a long time, is because I think it took a lot of experience to be able to handle a big American story that had many different features, as you say, policing, prison, reentry, early childhood education, different forms of work, the history of a neighborhood, how neighborhoods change, different forms of immigration, and to make it all part of a story. In other words, of course, when you're a writer and you're learning about your subject, you're teaching yourself. And then you're right that there's inevitably some element that you'll be offering your reader something new. But really, a reader isn't going to your nonfiction book when there are a lot of things out there to chew on a stick of wood instead of having delicious dessert to eat. And I guess the most difficult part are two things. One thing is, of the immense amount of material that you gather, choosing what will speak to the story you want to tell, and then two, making it into a story so that it really does feel to people like they are being told a story, not that they're being given some sort of master class on something that maybe they think the writer thinks they should know. But nobody really wants to read out of should. They want to read out of pleasure. Reading's supposed to be a pleasure, and a pleasure can be intriguing and interesting, but ultimately it still must be pleasure because there are a lot of books out there and a lot of really
Hmm.
good books out there.
I
So
don't know. I might have to push back on you on the plot. I did not find pleasure in this book. Although I understand what you mean because I love reading. But
I
I
mean, even
honestly,
just the language, the quality of
I
language, the
loved it.
quality
I
of coming to know people and so forth. I
Yes,
don't mean I mean good sad, I guess is what I'm saying.
yeah.
You
I mean,
know.
I'm changed. It has changed. It has forever changed me. Like I know where I was different when I read this. Like I know the moment I was very different, and I was just taken aback. And and I've had these conversations with friends who have read the book, and I'm about to engage in a conversation with somebody who's going to have a conversation with you, Ryan, who is engaging you at the YDS, because she was with me on Martha's Vineyard when I was going on, going on about this book, and she's reading it now, and she's like, "Oh Lord," and she's a reverend, like she's a minister. She's like, "This is a lot of story." I said, "It is a lot of story. It's a lot of stories. Um, it's a lot of story." And but it is teachable. Like I feel like I was learning something too. And I don't even know if that's the side effect, but it felt like I was learning something because there was so much, like I didn't even know about the predatory lending piece. I just thought that was awful. The loan piece. I've never heard of that. I had no awareness of that. And then I went and looked it up, and it just got on my it just wore me out. And I thought, this is there anybody that can stop this, or not so much? I don't know what the stop is. I just means who protects people from these kinds of things. Like how does this? But that's just one. It's one part of it that sort of tripped me up. The other part was uh so many moving parts, so many moving parts that just went along with the story. And I didn't see any intervention at any point, except for the late attorney Pollen. Like she was she could see very clearly that this was an injustice, and she quietly made inroads to change it. And how
I guess
did
I would
you
just
how
push
did
I'd
you
push
fit?
back a tiny bit and I would say that, you know, there are appearances by Michael Jefferson, who is a person who
Yes,
is pushing back, and
yes,
certainly Ken Rosenthal, another lawyer
yes,
in the book. He is
yes,
dedicating years of his life. There are all sorts of people. I mean, I feel as though one of the great things about New Haven is that there's a long history of people here who are civically oriented, who have
yeah.
real public concern. And they make it a really compelling, and for a small city, a chorus of very different and very affecting voices, right? But I think one
Hmm.
of the lessons of the country right now is that if you want real cultural change, if you want things to be better for lots of people, and that's what I mean by change, you can't do that unless major institutions participate. And it's major institutions, which places that have the real, I mean, we are talking about government, and we're talking about government institutions, or you're talking about large universities, or you're charging large corporations. Unless you have a civic orientation for, and I mean, you would think it was inevitable that government would be civically oriented, but not always, right? I mean, everybody's making choices, right? And usually making people making choices um, from their perceived self-interest. So unless you have a sense of enlightened self-interest from big institutions, then it's hard, no matter how many well-intended, good-hearted people you have, to affect, signal changes.
Mm.
That's one of
So
the,
go
I mean,
ahead.
for me, that was one of the most substantive things I learned. You can have all the goodwill in the world. I mean, Yale University is a really good example. There are untold generations of people at Yale University, professors, administrators, students, who have been open-hearted people who've come to New Haven, who've taken on New Haven in the small way that an individual can, and tried to be a good neighbor and a good citizen of the city, and to understand elements of the city, even as though they're going about their own business, going beyond themselves and so forth. And New Haven also, it's like Minneapolis is a city where per capita, there are more theaters than any city in the country. New
I
Haven's
did
always
not know
kind
that.
of, yeah. And New Haven unofficially has always been sort of noted as the place with more nonprofits per capita. There are all
Yeah.
kinds of small scale goodwill here. But unless you have major institutions who are working alongside all these well-intended people, there can be a real division between individual or small group of people effort and larger effort. And I think if you really ask me why I did this, it's because I never was clear that what I was seeing as a kid was acknowledged as a problem, that there were too
Mm.
many people, that there were all across this country, there were people living in proximity, some of whom had a lot, and for whom, and everybody's just busy with their lives, right? So this isn't necessary. I don't mean this in terms of aspersion or blame. I just mean that there's some people who have a lot, and then just right across that glass window or right across that invisible railroad track are people who are really struggling. And that the reason they're really struggling, it isn't their fault. The reason they're struggling is because they arrived at a place with a given understanding of how an economic model worked, and the economic model changed. And when you don't have a lot, it's hard to shift yourself and change along with it. And so I just wondered, ultimately, what it came down to is generations beginning early in the 19th century came from Europe and then eventually from South Carolina, North Carolina, other places like that, to this city because there were pretty well-paying jobs for undereducated, underskilled people who wanted to become skilled, who wanted to educate their kids, and who could eventually, at these jobs, buy a first house, buy a second house, get a car, get a bank account that eventually became tuition for their kids. So all around New Haven are people for whom this model worked. But once the model began to, with the decline of industry, once the model began not to exist anymore, then what? And I guess that was what I felt was a start, was just to acknowledge that there are all sorts of costs when something that seems promised doesn't then exist.
Mm.
And some individuals, of course, can pivot, but it takes a lot of personal agility and a lot of personal resources when what seems like a norm is gone. It takes an exception to do it. I mean, there's a point of view in America where everybody can sort of fix everything if they just try hard enough. But, there's that old line, which we've heard many, many times, but, it's hard to pull yourself up from your bootstraps when you don't have any boots. So I think that this is just, these are the kinds of things I'm thinking about. But in thinking about those things, nobody wants to hear, people just go on and on about the problems. People want to hear, actually, with some humanity, how those problems express themselves, and also the beautiful things about people, even when people are struggling. People are much more than struggle, and neighborhoods are much more than one way.
And so, and I would say that when you lay over race on top of this story, right? Because I don't know if this would be the same kind of story as white people. I mean, if the players were all white people, um, how do you reconcile that component to it? Like, how do you wade through those waters of racism, telling this
I think
story?
I think when you're talking about a segregated neighborhood where people are struggling, there are explanations for it. It isn't just it didn't just happen, right? And so you would want to know how it happened and why it happened and how you can overcome these issues. And I guess this is just my own opinion, but race layered with class is the most difficult American problem still. And that's not to say that there aren't many, many other American problems and that there aren't many other different kinds of communities with their own very real struggles. And everybody's struggles deserve to be recognized and to be understood and so forth. But there's a particular kind of struggle, I think, that we're talking about that is especially hard and especially enduring. And those are struggles that can't be understood, as most significant struggles can't be understood unless there's history. So that's why in the book, there's history at the beginning. I tried as well as I could to tell a tiny history of the country through the prism of one neighborhood. And that's why it goes back. And that's a lot. I mean, people probably hear that and they think, oh no, celery and carrots, but I mean, there are lots of ways to tell things. And I really did hope that in writing this, that there would be a sense of people being interested and it would arouse curiosity and engagement, that people would wonder suddenly, now that they were seeing that all over New Haven, the second most common license plate after Connecticut license plates would be South Carolina license plates. Why should that be? And it would open up a city and it would make a city feel more human and closer to you than simply a place where you lived and there are other people who are vaguely over there and over there and over there. It would make you feel more a part of things, no matter who you were.
That's an interesting thought. I think the people that I've talked to, I think the thing that they were most struck by, at least in all the conversations that I've had, people were struck by just the level of injustice, and it's such a contained injustice. Like it was just happening in real time in this community, and no one seemed to could figure out. I think what I was struck by is the level of fear during that particular time that people had about coming forward. I was struck by that. I was also struck by. I'm also struck by unsolved cases and how prevalent that is, and what happens to unsolved cases. Like what happens to those? Like what happens to the people who want to know what happened to their loved ones? Like what
Yeah, I
happened to
think
them?
for me, everything in specific speaks to something bigger and more general. So unsolved cases, it speaks to me first and foremost to trust. Like the way cases get solved is policing is a responsive business. People can't solve cases as police. I mean, for all the things that you see on Perry Mason or whatever all these shows are, where there's a sudden
Did you
line of
say
flute.
Perry Mason?
Well, didn't it just get revived or something? I grew up without a TV, so I don't know about the way back. Maybe that's the wrong guy. Maybe it was Mason Perry. No, I mean, that sort of model where the ingenious Sherlock Holmes like person can just solve every case because that detective is just such superlative skills. Really, the way cases get solved is police respond and they have sources of information, and the community comes together and helps people solve something that is a source of great pain for lots of people. So, I feel as though when that doesn't happen, largely it's an issue of trust. Nobody's going to trust police if police haven't become a part of the community themselves. In different policing, in New Haven, different policing generations have been better about it than some others. And there have been incredibly progressive administrations in policing, and there have been some that have been, less so. And but that's how I think about solves. I think about solves as sort of representative of police and community. And I also think, people say, well, if there's a high rate of violent crime, what needs to happen with policing to make it go down? But I always see it as a sort of a binary or dual problem. I see policing as a response to something that has happened, and maybe in some cases, the ability to have enough on the street information so things can be anticipated and cut off. But more usually, you never see a whole lot of violent crime in places where people are feeling fulfilled, where they feel there's a decent amount of opportunity, where they feel as though it's just neighborhoods where people aren't struggling, usually aren't neighborhoods where there's a lot of violence. I mean, name one. You can't. And so that to me is, I mean, the greatest policing of all is opportunity.
Hmm. So, you know, the book has been out for quite some time now. Lots of people have read it, and the paperback is coming out. What do you want people to know about this book, Nicholas? Like, what do you want people to, when they read this book, when they choose this book, what are you hoping for them?
Well, I guess it's just some of the things that you and I have just been discussing. I hope it deepens their sense of cities and how they work. And also it gives a sense, I mean, I feel as though the people who are written about in the book are neighbors, and they're neighbors of one another in the book, but they really, I hope, are sort of representative American neighbors, that these are people who you know just a little better through a book. And just as you get through your neighbors, you get to know other people's experiences, and the world broadens and the world deepens. I hope that's what happens too. And I suppose there are all sorts of, you know, things in terms of personal vanity that you would hope. In other words, you would hope that people would enjoy the story, that you wrote the story well enough and carefully enough so that you know, that people would get, if not joy, a certain kind of pleasure from something that they care about. Does that make sense?
Yes, I will tell you, I live next door to the woman who was an extreme couponer.
I
Like
love that.
I live next door to her, and I would have not put two and two together had I not read the book. Like I was like, oh, I live next door to this lady.
See, that's the thing about neighborhoods, and the thing about life is that it's easy enough to, somebody goes on Wikipedia and they read about a state or a neighborhood or a city or something, they get all the demographics and, the brief thumbnail descriptions of a place. But places are really made up by individuals, and the individuals who come together and are their own people too. And just as, you on your porch is one kind of person, and the guy driving by selling you, things that he grew on his farm, and he drove up through the night, and the way he sells them, and then the way you cook them, and the way they taste, and who you invite over to have them, and just all the stories, good and bad. That's neighborhood. And that's, I mean, what do we all remember through life? We remember, sort of our surroundings as we grew up. We remember, what really happened on the first day of school. You start out with your sidewalk, and it's just, you're a little kid and you've got the sidewalk in front of your house, and that delimits the whole world, right? And you know everything about every crack, and the meridian going out to the street, and and then as you get older, the sidewalk just lengthens and lengthens, and there are more and more things you know why that lady dropped her shopping bag. The first time I ever saw somebody drop their shopping bag, and everything in that shopping bag just all over the street, and the expression on that old lady's face who was walking by me, and I'm a little kid, and I don't know why this is coming to mind now, but it was a really profound experience, just the way she looked as all her eggs smashed. I mean, she must have been late into her 80s. And I'd seen disappointment plenty. I mean, anybody who grows up with a single mom just seen plenty of, challenges. But seeing that lady's face when she dropped her shopping bag, and there was nothing a little kid could do to help because everything was broken. There was milk and there were eggs, and everything was broken, and it was all over. And the shopping bag, the brown bottom went out. And I was just, you didn't even have to talk to her, and you could see just how much more it cost her than it would cost most people. Because part of it was the walk, and I now know, having lived a little more life, that it was, when you are as elderly as she appeared to be, and you are as thin, as frail as she appeared to be, and I know how far away the stores were from my house then, I know what it takes to still have your own volition and your own independence and agency, to be a person who still goes shopping for yourself. And I just remember, how much more would have gone into it than just somebody going and picking up some eggs. And so I think that's neighborhood too.
I like it. Well, it's always a pleasure talking to you, and I'm gonna meet you for coffee in a little bit. We're gonna have more conversation. So, I would imagine you are a good observer of the world. What are you working on now?
I'm actually writing a book about an observer of the world. The person, no, it's true. That's the person many people think is the greatest American photographer there ever was. And it's a guy named Robert Frank, who in the 1950s took a series of photographs that are called The Americans. And in the 1950s, this was still a time when public photography, in other words, photography meant for mass distribution, were generally pictures of people who are either very famous or celebrated. Celebrity was a new concept then, or people who are in the news, big in the news. It wasn't just what he would have called ordinary people. And he spent years driving around the entire country, taking 27,000 photographs
Oh,
of what he called ordinary Americans. And then the book became 83 pictures of the 27,000. It's called The Americans. And it is a fantastic book. But the story of the journey and then what he and his life and what that book meant, and then what he did with all the rest of his life. I mean, he's a great American artist, and it is he's like the artist's artist, and it is the story of him. And in certain ways, you can imagine how somebody who worked on a project as I just did would feel a certain kind of, I mean, I met him, I knew him for the last 10 years of his life, and he died well into his 90s. So you could imagine how somebody who had had that experience was a wonderful person to talk with as I was working on this project, but also how that particular experience and the ability to see with a camera lens deep into the lives of other people and just in these fleeting moments create visual short stories. It's really an incredible and, to me, significant and, thrilling thing to do. And not just me. I mean, you talk to Bruce Springsteen, or you talk to, you can't imagine the number of artists who keep copies of that book very close at hand when they are working on their own art. I mean, when Bruce Springsteen wrote Nebraska, for example, he had a copy of that book in every room of his house, because that book was his, source stone. It was the locus of inspiration. And, you can imagine that somebody who could do something like that would be a pretty complicated and ambivalent and, fascinating character themselves. So it's going to be a little book about him.
oh, I can't wait. Well, hopefully it won't come out until I finish all the other Nicholas Dawidoff books
That's like a
that I have
piano on the back.
that I have stacked in little places. Like, okay, I got through this one, I'm gonna get through the other one. So thank you for your time this morning. And
Oh,
this
it's
is a
always nice to talk
paperback.
to you.
Everybody, go and find it at your local booksellers. I go to Possible Futures, and you can too. And Lauren over there will order it if it's not sitting in the stores. But this is over there too, and hard copy. But it's well worth your read. Like, it is. It's challenging and it's a ride, but it is quite illuminating. So thank you, Nicholas. It's good talking to you.
It's always good to talk with you, Babz. Have a beautiful day.
I'll see you in a little bit for coffee.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you, Harry Charles. I'll see y'all tomorrow. Thank you, Paul Bass. I hope everybody is well. I'll be back tomorrow. Y'all behave yourselves. 50 years of hip hop.